Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable. I'm glad you talked about Madison's essay on property because I was thinking about that too, and you did it much better than I could have. I mean, my only little footnote to what you said about that is he's in kind of he's sort of subtweeting, or he may actually quote Blackstone right in that essay.
Madison subtweeting Blackstone.
Yeah. He don't at me, bro, said Blackstone to Madison, but that's kind of what he's doing, and he does, I think, quote Blackstone's sort of more narrow definition. And then he goes on to say, but actually in its broader and more reasonable context, you have a property in your opinions, in your life, in your all these things. And on one level, perhaps it feels like a sort of exercise in futility to cite 18th century political philosophy disputes when Nicole Hannah-Jones is out here, as she did, in fact, say in 2020, your right to your property is not that important. Right. It's life that matters. On the other hand, of course, it only goes to show how incredibly perceptive and incisive these kind of articulations of our founding principles were at the time, and the fact that returning to them helps to understand and hopefully also refute kind of what's going on. Hello, and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. I'm your host, features editor Spencer Clavin, and I am joined this week by managing editor Seth Barron and publisher and president Ryan Williams. Much has occurred since last we three met and spoke. We recorded sort of right before the second Republican presidential debate last week. And not only that, but in the midst of sort of the week that unfolded, there have been some developments in the whole fight we were talking about vis-a-vis the government shutting down and Republicans in the House. We are going to get to that and to the ouster of Speaker Kevin McCarthy. But first, we wanted to talk about these kind of eerie and, to me, very sad and disturbing stories that are all kind of falling in one week, like this cluster of deaths that all follow a particular pattern. They are related clearly, or seem to be instances of the crime waves that are rising in cities across America, but they're also all, the victims are all sort of high profile liberals or social justice activists. And there have been some very kind of weird and spooky and very online things going on. The first one to mention is Ryan Carson, who was an activist in Crown Heights, was stabbed to death. Then we've got this guy, Josh Kruger, a sort of lefty journalist who was videotaped. Ryan Carson was videotaped gruesomely being stabbed to death. You can watch him try to get in between the knife-wielding maniac and his girlfriend late at night on the streets of the city. Then Josh Kruger was the one who kind of made fun of Scott Adams, whom he called the Dilbert dude. He's now become a bit of a political figure, saying, Adams had said there's a good chance he will be dead if Biden is elected. And Kruger said, ha ha ha, look at this prediction from 2020. It's like he's Nostradamus or something. And then he was, in fact, killed by, we're not, I don't think, sure yet by whom, but he did say 2 weeks before his death that a man he'd never met before came to his house and referred to themselves, says the report, as Lady Diabla, the she-devil of the streets, and threatened him and Kruger. Finally, we have the death of Pava LaPere. This was somebody that I'm sort of known in the tech world, not a name that you will possibly have heard of, but a Baltimore tech CEO who has also been killed, and all of these kind of slot into this for certain political operatives, a very uncomfortable location of, people living in these big cities, in many cases advocating for, voting for the policies that lead to rising crime, suffering, like these really dramatic, kind of almost illustrative fates. And there's been a lot of like online discourse about, are we allowed to talk about this? How do we talk about it? Obviously, any death is a horror and a tragedy. Also, however, these conform to a particular pattern that people sort of feel like they need to be able to speak about. I know Seth was talking before we started recording about the reaction on the part of politicians in New York to the whole Carson video. Maybe we can start there. Seth, do you want to describe sort of how people have been responding?
Sure. But first of all, I kind of want to say it's not really that. I mean, it seems like a weird coincidence. But then again, it's like if in the 19th century someone was saying, wow, all of the people getting boiled up in cannibals' pots are missionaries. And how could this be? It's like, well, that's who's there. I mean, that's like that.
Right.
That's who goes there
Right.
and like hangs around and stays there. So it's not really in a weird way. Like, okay, if you're going to live in whatever crappy part of Philadelphia that guy lived in, or if you're going to hang around on Malcolm X Boulevard in Bed-Stuy at 4 a.m. waiting for a bus, or if you're going to live wherever in Baltimore that gal lived. I mean, I'm not saying you deserve to be killed, but you certainly have a higher chance of it. And, I would imagine it's going to be these liberal activist types who imagine that because of their essential goodness and the rectitude of their opinion, are immune somehow from street violence and from racial antipathy.
Right, because those forms of violence are only inspired by systemic injustice, which they consider themselves to be
Yeah,
proponents of, and they
would
assume that they'll be recognized as such.
sure. But back to what you were asking me, yeah, it's really interesting. All of these politicians in New York are just going, many of whom I gather knew this fellow Ryan Carson, are beside themselves that people are tweeting out links to the video, and they're saying this has no, there's no, and they're really mad at the media, like the New York Post and other, local TV stations for amplifying it. They're like, there's no media, there's no good reason for this. It's just for clicks. It's just gruesome. Why are you, re-traumatizing the community? Why are you doing this? They're really angry about it. Of course, at the same time, these are precisely the same people who couldn't stop watching the George Floyd video or the Eric Garner video or the video of the guy in Wisconsin. I can't remember his name, who was shot by the cops. And I mean, they love to they linger over these like obsessively, like
Hmm.
lovingly. They adore it. They promote it. They want these images and their final words and all of that to be repeated and ground into everyone's consciousness like fine glass. Um,
Ugh.
because it serves a particular purpose. There's a narrative that they like. They don't like the narrative. They don't like the impression that people might get that, oh, here's this couple that went to a wedding and now they are walking down the street and they're dressed nicely, and this total raving lunatic black guy for no reason murders one of them within 30 seconds of like encountering him. That is not the right message. So all of these politicians and all of these people's friends are saying like, look, Ryan, what he would have wanted, as justice for his death, was to fix this broken city. Like that's what we need to do. So, a state senator said, "Look, this is a call for like world socialism. We need to improve this. We need to improve." Basically, the implication is that if we'd had higher taxes, this wouldn't have happened. And to me, that's more ghoulish than saying, "Oh, I hope they catch." Nobody's saying, "I hope they catch this guy and put him in prison." Like that. That's just not really. That's not really what they're about. They're about punishing the people who are supposedly gloating about the guy's death. And I really, frankly, haven't seen too much of that, though they keep saying it's there. Anyway, sorry, that was a long winded answer, but that's pretty much my take on the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, the entire thing is an orchestrated war on pattern recognition, right? And the whole sort of point is to file certain events exception under exceptions to the rule and other things under the rule. And usually that is kind of the exact opposite of the trends for some philosophically interested reason. I mean, the most sort of chilling part of this Ryan Carson video to me is that he kind of tries to get in between his girlfriend and this lunatic as if they're going to kind of talk it out together or reason together, which is on one level an extremely noble impulse. Like the kind of underlying raw instinct there is virtuous and good to defend his girlfriend. But it's been funneled through this totally false and insane view of the world that this guy just needs to be kind of talked to, and we can de-escalate the situation with these sort of social worker tactics, and there I feel like you're seeing somebody that has really, bought the lie, like is just totally in on and sold for this narrative. And it as an activist might say on the other side, it's literally killing people. Like you're just watching the people victims of their own cockamamie ideology, or victims of the people who have been sort of selling them this false narrative. And yeah, I mean, it is incredibly tragic, but it's tragic in a way that we should be able, I think, to talk about beyond just saying like, oh, how sad. It's sad, and it's a kind of the result of a calculated distortion of people's vision of the world for political reasons.
It's interesting. We've drawn the Trump-Nixon analogies before, and in a weird way, are we there again with the rising law and order argument? I don't know. The interesting question to me is, yeah, how the left will react to this. Now, we've heard how the left in New York is reacting to it, um, but it will be interesting to see how any of this reverberates back towards the electorate and then back up to actual elected officials in the Democratic Party. I mean, it's very hard to think that nothing has changed since the late '60s on this question. So you'd think, well, some things have changed, some things have not. I mean, we sort of corrected for the late '60s and had these many decades of fairly low violent crime in our big cities, and it's nowhere near yet in New York or elsewhere back to where it was in the '70s. I don't think. Certainly not in Los Angeles, where it was quite high in the early '70s. But we've been accustomed to much lower violent crime rates in the cities, and now they're creeping back up. Now the Democrats are insulated, especially the ones that have constituents in the cities, because their constituents are so overwhelmingly Democrat. What are they going to do? Flee to a Republican? But there are some cracks showing. The Dallas mayor switching parties is a good example from Democrat to Republican. So, yeah, I it'll be. I'm most interested to see how different candidates, both sort of meta national, and by that I mean the presidential candidates, and then national but smaller stakes, House races and stuff leading up to the next election. It will be an interesting thing to watch to see how this issue resonates, and we're just returning to some good old fashioned wisdom, which applies. If you're in Crown Heights at 4 a.m. in the morning, you don't walk towards the kind of muttering to himself angry black man. That's just a bad idea. Or if he was white, also a crazy white dude muttering to himself at 4 a.m. Bad idea.
Well, right.
Bad
Yeah.
idea.
I mean, like,
Like
there's
the
definitely,
video
yeah.
confuses me. I don't understand why he got up with her and decided to walk towards that guy. I mean, it just defies all common sense.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of stuff that we might not know about that interaction, and there's certainly details that
Yeah,
could
we have video with
emerge.
no audio, so it's like, we're
Right.
through glass darkly, to say the least.
Totally. And so this is really kind of less about that particular, obviously horrifying event and more about what we know to be an attitude because it's well documented among kind of well-meaning, incredibly idealistic, utopian like activists who have totally drunk the woke Kool-Aid that all this requires is really just like talking it out. I mean, this was the suggestion, right? Was you're going to replace police with social workers
Yeah.
and these like poor misunderstood G officer Krupke were really okay. You know, we need an analyst's care, all of that stuff, which has been the governing theory of criminal activity on the left. I mean, I would say since Rousseau, but like
Mm.
certainly since the 60s, you know. And this is like, you know, Myron Magnet was writing about this already in the 90s. Bill Vogley has done a lot of writing for Claremont Review of Books about this. And I just wanted to mention two pieces that he wrote. One is called Crime and the Democrats Revisited, and one is called Criminal Negligence. And he cites these instances of there's first of all, there's the kind of self-satisfied and snide attitude to people that suggest it's maybe like not great living in the cities. Like, oh, you're afraid of like the bodegas when you go to get your cafecito. Like, you know, I'm so authentic that I feel like I can just waltz down the street. You know, here's John Hamasaki, who ran to succeed Chesa Boudin in San Francisco. He said, "Would getting your car window broken and some stuff stolen leaves you scarred forever? Is this what the suburbs do to you? Shelter you from basic city life experiences so that when they happen, you are broken to the core?" And then, even more amazing, here's this paragraph from Criminal Negligence. He says, in the weeks following George Floyd, this is Bill Bogley, in the weeks following George Floyd's death in May 2020, Minneapolis resident Mitchell Erickson was the victim of an attempted carjacking at gunpoint by two black teenagers. According to the New York Times, Erickson, quote, said later that he would not cooperate with prosecutors in a case against the boys, having come to realize that if there was anything he wanted, it was to offer them help. He subsequently came to regret calling the police in the first place. I put these boys in danger of death by calling the cops. But what about the other consequences? So I would have lost my car, Erickson said. So what? At least no one would have been killed. A year later, the Minneapolis police reported that carjackings had tripled in the city, while murders and non-fatal shootings doubled. In one incident, 3 carjackers died in a one-vehicle accident while fleeing the police. I mean, this is just kind of a thing that sounds nice and maybe should be true, that people are basically good inside, and all we really need is to care for them rightly and readjust society to accommodate them, and then they'll stop doing crime. But it's just flatly not true. And just as when it was proposed as the Pelagian heresy, so now, like, clinging to it is actually to develop a death wish and to prefer your own fantasies about the kumbaya over, you know, actual people's lives and genuinely dealing with crime in the cities.
Well, there's this funny trope that the left brings out all the time. You know, if you burn down an entire neighborhood, well, so what? You know, they have insurance. Shoplifting has to be permitted because they have insurance. Carjacking should not be criminalized, or, you know, highly criminalized, because, you know, you can always just get into. Now, I mean, here's the thing: it's true that property is, you know, not worth a human life. However, human life depends on property. I mean,
Right.
society as we know it, and prosperity, everything that we associate with goodness essentially has to do with, you know, small g goodness has to do with property. The destruction of property leads to negative consequences inevitably. We're seeing this now with, like, a Target in East Harlem is closing, and all these people are infuriated. They're saying, like, you know, because of theft. They're saying there's no
Right.
reason why Target, a multi-billion-dollar company, can't figure out more effective ways to deal with this. They're traitors to the community. Brandon Johnson in Chicago suggested that perhaps the city should open up city-owned grocery stores to replace grocery stores that are shutting down because of theft. Now that idea just seemed like just too delicious. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, as though Chicago does such a great job running everything else, that uh, that they should become like grocers. And what
I
is
look
this
forward
idea?
to the Whole Foods like needle spot where you can shoot up your heroin in safety, like in the
Well, what
whatever.
is the
Yeah.
idea that, like, as though people who steal from Whole Foods would not steal from a municipal grocery store? Or I guess the idea is if they did, it wouldn't matter because they would just replace everything.
Yeah, because
Um,
government money's not real, right? It's your
Government
money,
money's
so
not
it
real.
doesn't actually register. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and essentially food should be free anyway, so who cares?
Right.
Um, Listen, this is a real disaster. The whole idea that cops, just if you don't mind me, just indulge me on this. This
Do it. Yeah.
idea that cops, we always hear it. Look, cops should not be the first responders for people who are suffering a mental health crisis. We need to send in social workers. Well, here's the thing: social workers are far less trained than cops. Cops spend all their time going and diffusing like violent situations that they are not personally involved in. That's the whole point of cops. Is That's why you should call them, because they don't care. They do this all day long and they're not going to get involved in your dispute. They're there to like separate people and calm it down. They don't run in shooting. I mean, it's there's like hundreds of millions of police civilian interactions every year. Very few of them result in even any force at all. And the idea that what social workers, they're just fantasizing if they think that there's social workers are going to want to go and get between, get in front of some crazy person with a hatchet. Like that's not what they want to do. Um, you know, they want to deal with like the easy stuff, which makes sense. I don't know. Anyway, so I'm just saying that this whole narrative that the left has been promoting over the last 10 years or so it is a suicide. It is a kind of suicide pact where they say, okay, you kill yourself today and I'll go tomorrow.
Yeah, it's like
Um,
I would rather die than admit that this is like a problem, or I would rather other people die essentially in like poor areas of the city than that I admit that I've been wrong about my grand theory
This
of life.
this brings up so many thoughts.
Oh, good.
For
Go off, King.
first, I'm reminded of Seth sort of laughing at what the social worker is going to do. I'm reminded of this bit of Claremont lore of back in the day. Obviously, it wasn't in the '60s, but Alan Bloom talked about the uprising on Cornell's campus, and it was one of the contempt with which he held the administration for how they dealt with it is one of the reasons he left for the University of Toronto. But I've heard told that Harry Jaffa and Harry Newman, much less known, but another political philosophy teacher at the graduate school in Claremont, they used to run this sort of Harry and Harry show. Harry Jaffa, the West Coast Straussian, versus Harry Newman, the
Hmm.
proud but sort of honest nihilist. You'd ask Harry how he's doing, that is Newman, and he'd always say 50-50, how else could I be doing? But anyway,
Hmm.
Harry and Harry were laughing at this these lines, and I think they were in Closing of the American Mind, where Bloom's solution to tell his students what they should do with these radicals was to, basically have a seminar on Plato with them and convince them.
Doesn't he have them like to bring out a
Notes,
copy of the
yeah,
Republic or
Republic,
something?
yes,
Yeah.
just laughable. The other thought, I have two more. One other thought is this distinction that we've drawn between property and life. I think,
Oh, good. I'm glad. Okay,
yeah,
I was about to go down this
it
rabbit
just
hole, so I'm
it's
glad that you.
people should revisit this wonderful short essay, which was originally an op-ed by James Madison on property, where he basically gets back to the old Lockean notion that there's really no distinction at all between rights and property because they're the same thing. He says, if we could be said to have uh, a right to property, we can also be said to have a property in our rights. So that's interesting. But the real breaking point, people should revisit it. Madison is right. Uh, at some point, somebody in the founding writes that well, actually, I should put it this way: our colleague Ed Erler likes to lecture about that property essay, and he calls the right to property as the kind of um, the jingly can on the concertina wire around civilization that, when encroaches on property rights, start from the government or from its lack of action, you really need to be on your guard because the other rights are coming next, including your right to life. All very applicable here. And then finally, I know you're all wondering what this has to do with a 1938 Supreme Court case. having to do with the Filled Milk Act of 1923. Well, I'm here to tell you
I'm getting live stream messages actually right now saying, please, clamoring for you to
it's the beginning of this separation, actually, of this distinction between economic rights and political rights. There was a case called Carolene Products, and it has this famous footnote 4, uh, which at the time did not have to do with this larger universe of issues and the separation between economic rights and property rights that would emerge after the New Deal and in subsequent years, in which we live in now. And all I mean by that is there is sort of much more scrutiny of, say, civil rights uh, than there are about quote unquote economic rights or property rights. And a lot of these commentators, though they don't know it, descend from this tradition. And the famous footnote is this. I'll just read a couple, just really 2 short paragraphs. There may be a narrower scope for operation of the presumption of constitutionality when legislation appears on its face to be within a specific prohibition of the Constitution, such as those of the first 10 amendments, which are deemed equally specific when held to be embraced within the 14th. That just means, applied against the states. And then, nor need we inquire, this is the really telling paragraph. It is unnecessary to consider now whether legislation which restricts those political processes which can ordinarily be expected to bring about repeal of undesirable legislation is to be subjected to more exacting judicial scrutiny under the general prohibitions of the 14th Amendment than are most other types of legislation. So this just means, if you're impinging on the right to vote, for example, it means that you're probably more able to deprive those people that you're restricting the vote of their rights. So this, of course, has to do with access to the ballot and racial minorities, et cetera. Nor need we inquire whether similar considerations enter into the review of statutes directed at particular religious or national or racial minorities, whether prejudice against discrete and insular minorities may be a special condition, which tends seriously to curtail the operation of those political processes ordinarily to be relied upon to protect minorities, and which may call for a correspondingly more searching judicial inquiry. So you have it all here. The distinction between, in many ways, sort of heightened scrutiny of rights protection for discrete and insular minorities, quote unquote, whether of racial, religious, et cetera. This severing between political rights or rights that are close to political access, and by implication, there's all these economic rights, because this whole case has to do with property rights and the Filled Milk Act and regulation of milk properties, et cetera. So here you have it. This is sort of, and in jurisprudential circles, this is a famous case and a famous footnote. So this is why I bring it up. It's interesting there are all these reverberations of obscure cases and language that then play out over decades and decades and decades. And we're heir to that tradition, even if we don't know it. And then the sort of rhetorical impulse of a lot of the left to continue to draw this division between, your car and, your car getting carjacked or you getting shot in the head. It doesn't make any philosophical sense. It doesn't make much common sense. After all, if they're willing to steal your vital means of you securing a living, moving around, holding a gun to your head and taking your car, it's obvious that they're not that far. It's a pretty thin line between that and taking your life. It shows they have no respect for you, and they're treating you like their slave. So they could go the next step pretty easily. So anyway, those are all the thoughts that were conjured up. And
that's great. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you talked about Madison's essay on property, because I was thinking about that too, and you did it much better than I could have. I mean, my only little footnote to what you said about that is he's in kind of he's like sort of subtweeting, or he may actually quote Blackstone right in that essay.
Madison subtweeting Blackstone.
Yeah, he don't at me, bro.
Yeah,
said Blackstone to Madison, but that's kind of what he's doing, and he does, I think, quote Blackstone's sort of more narrow definition. And then he goes on to say, but actually, in its broader and more reasonable context, like you have a property in your opinions,
Yeah.
in your life, in your all these things. And on one level, perhaps it feels like a sort of exercise in futility to cite, 18th century political philosophy disputes in when Nicole Hannah-Jones is out here, like, as she did, in fact, say in 2020, your right to your property is not that important.
Right.
It's life that matters. On the other hand, of course, it only goes to show how incredibly perceptive and incisive these kind of articulations of our founding principles were at the time, and the fact that returning to them helps to understand and hopefully also refute kind of what's going on. We got to move on from this. I think we could probably talk about this all day, but at least I want to get to Kevin McCarthy, who is out as Speaker. The dad joke that I made online is that we have reached the end of the McCarthy era. We talked last week about this like ongoing fight in the House between sort of the eager young guns and these new rabble rousing Republicans with the so-called establishment or their concerns about business as usual. This is obviously a major point of contention on that subject is, are we going to keep spending money? What are we going to spend it on? Are we going to keep throwing money at Ukraine? We talked about sort of all that last week. Well, what we didn't talk about, because it hadn't happened yet, is one of the concessions that this new group of representatives got when McCarthy was assuming the speakership, was that any member at any time for any reason could call for a vote to vacate, that is to kick the speaker out. And Matt Gaetz from Florida has in fact done exactly that, and successfully. So Kevin McCarthy is now out. He won't run for Speaker of the House again. It was 216 to 210, the vote, with 8 Republicans and then all the Democrats voting to oust McCarthy. So very charged and high stakes arguments going on within the sort of conservative movement now over whether this represents a principled stance and real willingness to fight, or a craven and cynical and self-promoting alliance between Gaetz and his fellow voters and the Democrats, siding with the Democrats to spite the Republican capitulation to the Democrats. I mean, that's the argument against it. The argument for it is made, I think, really well by Gaetz himself. Gaetz is often portrayed as sort of a buffoon, and whether you agree with him or not, he's not that. I commend his episode on Timcast if you're interested in sort of seeing how that works. I mean, his point is, at some point we have to make trouble. We have to sort of stop things from going along just as they usually have. This is of a piece with and in line with their efforts to reduce the number of things that go into each bill, to give people time to actually read the bills, to separate topics of legislation and discussion so that the people that are in charge can actually claim to have considered and discussed the things that they're talking about, rather than just shunting them off into these giant omnibus packages that have one good thing and like 20 bad things in them. What do you guys think? Is this gonna be was this a good move? Will it reap dividends? And if so, what?
We'll see.
Yeah.
I this is it's often a virtue for us to be in our various ways scattered over geographically. That is to say, Spencer in Tennessee, Seth in New York and or DC, me out on the West Coast. But then the Institute spiritually way far away for our history, away from DC. But on this sort of thing, I always find it useful to check in with some friends on the Hill who know the world well and are working in it. And so I did that. So my following comments will be a blend of my initial reactions and what I've learned from them. So I think people are nervous about the extent to which Gaetz and his allies look to have run into this without much of a plan after. There are all sorts of unintended consequences that could crop up. This may be a shot you really just fire once for full effect, and then it has reverberating, perhaps negative consequences going forward. One of which might be, the left wing of the caucus. What's their reaction going to be going forward with conservatives continuing to have more votes than them and trying to run the show? Conservatives and right wingers of various stripes. Is the line to the left wing of the caucus now going to be, well, you should play by the rules because the rules are important? Or will this open a kind of Pandora's box? I liked it initially in a qualified way because things on Capitol Hill and in Congress have been so sclerotic for so long and so dominated by leadership. This has really been a problem for 30 years. It's part of what Gaetz said in his floor debate and where he said elsewhere. And so the breaking up of that notion of the way of doing things, the introduction of some creative thinking about new possibilities, and just, moving the Overton window a bit about procedural possibility. All that seems to me to be encouraging and interesting, and it's all very fun because normally Congress is a very boring place to see kind of blood on the floor, metaphorically speaking. That said,
Yeah, in Minecraft, a
in
metaphor.
Minecraft.
Yeah.
But it's kind of terra incognita in a way, so it's very hard to understand what will come next. I mean, what we do know is that next week on Tuesday they'll have this candidate forum, I think behind closed doors. I think on Wednesday they'll vote. If they don't get anyone to 218, then there will be a similar debate to the last time when McCarthy ascended as Speaker. The front runner, Steve Scalise, Jim Jordan has a chance. Jim Banks and J.D. Vance and others have endorsed Jim Jordan's candidacy for the speakership. So that's all very interesting. One thing I didn't think about, which was relayed to me by one of our former fellows who's very close to a lot of this, works in the Senate, said that there might be one silver lining is that the Democrats let the masks slip. And so people may be confused about why now McHenry, who's the acting speaker, he's the little guy in the bow tie who slammed the gavel down really hard. It's become a bit of a meme on the internet. Why he's kicked Pelosi and Steny Hoyer out of their offices. It's because McCarthy, when he agreed to the one vote vacate rule, which is one member could move the seat to be vacated. When he agreed to that, which would have been pretty threatening to him, he was assured behind the scenes by Democrats that they'd help it not result in him vacating his seat. And Pelosi and the Democrats screwed him. So that's why there's some vindictive score settling going on. Our source says that there may be more getting kicked out of their offices. And office space and proximity to the Capitol is a very highly prized commodity in DC. It's just a lot easier to get work done and be more effective when you can walk down the hall to leadership and confer, and you don't have to walk a long way to votes. And you don't have to pull fire alarms like Jamal Bowman to try to get out of locked doors to get over to the Capitol from the House offices.
Good.
So
I'm glad we got to that.
there's
Yeah.
all of this going on. So the silver lining was maybe the more establishment Dem type or Republican types finally realized what the Dems have in store for them. That they, really, if they could do it, they would like to put them all in gulags, so that maybe they'll finally know what time it is. And I'm exaggerating a little bit with the gulag thing, but all of this is what came to mind. I'll just finish by saying the looming, the regular order stuff is all true. I mean, Gaetz laying out the problem of legislating over the last 30 years, the fact that they don't do appropriations for individual departments, and they wanted to get back to regular order, and McCarthy sort of still prevented them, et cetera. All the spending stuff, all true. But really, the interesting thing to watch out of all this is what about Ukraine funding, which when the speakership was negotiated with McCarthy ascending 8 months ago, was a little more of a we're not sure issue on the right, but the polling has turned against it on the Republican base and then Republicans generally since that time. And members have seemed to be more committed to saying, look, we've got so many problems at home, spending's out of control. We just can't keep shoveling money out the door to Ukraine. We've got to, or if we do, we need to really offset it with a bunch of other stuff. So that's really, I think, what a lot of people are thinking of. Jim Jordan initially said that, no more Ukraine funding. And then a spokesperson for him kind of walked that back shortly thereafter and said, well, if there's Ukraine funding, there's got to be offsets elsewhere. So that's the lay of the land as far as we know from friends and my initial judgments. So
My take on this, like people are saying, like, oh my word, this is going to paralyze Washington. Congress won't get anything done. It's like, yeah, exactly. That's great. What's wrong with that? Congress was supposed to shut down last week, but then they arranged the last minute 45-day spending bill. And people in DC, I know, are like, oh, this is going to be a disaster for the Republicans. And it's like, when the government shuts down, and it seems to happen every year, it's the same dance and the same charade. Everybody in DC and in that kind of bubble imagines that this is something that the nation that the whole nation is paralyzed. But in reality, most people could care less if, okay, it screws up getting your passport. If you want to visit a national park, you can't go to the national park. They still send out Social Security checks. It's a measure of the self-importance of Washington to think that paralysis there means anything outside of there, which it mostly doesn't. And to me, if Congress is consumed with this internal thing, exactly, okay, well then they can't if they're fighting over who's going to be speaker, well, then they can't, send more money to Ukraine. They can't permit all this other crazy stuff. I mean, it would be look if they were going to get together and somehow come up with a way to close the border. Oh, that'd be great, but they're not. And when I look back at the Republican speakers of the House, they've been so uniformly depressing, um, and like Paul Ryan, I thought was kind of weak. What's his name? Boehner was just horrible. I don't know, Hastert. I guess I wasn't paying that much attention back then, but I mean, didn't he go to prison? Um, and I guess McCarthy. I don't know. I mean, he seemed okay, but again, it's all sort of weak. Like, why can't we have someone who's going to, stand up and do something, not just like, isn't just biding time until they can get like a sinecure at Citigroup or something. So I don't know. I think it would be great if Steve Scalise or Jim Jordan became speaker. At least, I mean, sort of, it might liven things up. So as far as that goes, I'm not against it.
Yeah, I mean, that era of Ryan, the Paul Ryans of the world, is just totally gone. There was a time when he really sent a thrill down the spine of the cutting edge conservative commentariat, right? Oh, here's this young gun. And like, now we realize we didn't know from young guns that will actually disrupt things. I mean, there is a way in which, Seth, I think, shutting down the government isn't disruptive enough. Like, it doesn't register enough on people's radars. Marxists will always say of like capitalism and bourgeois capitalism that it is able to kind of assimilate critiques of it into itself so that it creates this like domesticated opposition. And that's kind of how these government shutdowns seem to go. Is it's like, oh, we have a crisis, like things cannot possibly go on. And like precisely by enacting that drama every year, we avoid ever actually doing anything about it because it comes to seem as if this crisis is actually totally uninteresting and surmountable. And so that is sort of my feeling about this whole Gaetz thing is, on the one hand, if your project is actually to get serious about changing the status quo, if the status quo has gotten locked in but isn't working, and yet there are reasons why vested interests will prevent you from trying to change it, then at some point when you put your money where your mouth is and do what you say you were going to do, there's going to be some incredibly disruptive and chaotic moment when, as Ryan indicates, like things suddenly get interesting that have been boring and also stale for a very long time. And so it's not a problem to me necessarily that Gaetz is doing something, or that, these Republicans and the Democrats together are doing something that causes all this confusion and disruption. I mean, that is baked into what they want to do, and I think what they want to do is necessary. My problem is that I feel like there's a bit of an underpants gnome phenomenon going on here. The South Park routine where they're like, step 1, steal underpants. Step 3, profit. Step 2, question mark, question mark, question mark. And I wonder what goes into the question marks. Gaetz does seem like a smart guy to me, and I guess it seems like maybe if they can get somebody in there that is more serious, less of a kind of party guy, less willing to play by the rules, then that's the first step toward actually getting serious concessions on Ukraine and spending generally and all of that. It may happen. I just don't know exactly what the game plan is here, which, as Ryan says, is at least sort of interesting.
It led to this funny thing on Twitter that I saw, which is, you mentioned the Young Guns, Spencer, that this was the book with Paul Ryan, Eric Cantor, and Kevin McCarthy on the cover of it, published in 2010, right. September of 2010. And so someone said it's the most cursed book cover ever because, Paul Ryan, former speaker, didn't have too much success as speaker. Eric Cantor, of course, surprisingly upset in his campaign and defeated in his reelection campaign. And then now Kevin McCarthy gone down in defeat. So
let me just add something. I just got this email from the Forward, the Jewish paper. And every day they have some crazy stuff in there. They send out like what their headlines are.
I just unsubscribed from them because
they're so awful.
Getting myself all.
Yeah. Matt Gaetz and the mainstreaming of conspiracy, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism. Is Matt Gaetz mainstreaming anti-Semitism? I mean, just leave it to the phone. I mean, Oh, the other day the forward said that Ira Glass should get the Nobel Prize for literature. I mean, they're just like so out of their mind.
Sure, whatever. Why not? Right.
I don't even know where they're coming from. Sorry, I don't know. I thought that was funny. That
No, I mean, these are all, this is like drag and drop, right? It's like some prominent Republican does some prominent thing, copy paste his name into like, and the mainlining of QAnon conspiracy,
yes,
Well, it's like
anti-Semitism, and whatever.
the bullet points from Jamal Bowman's office initially about the talking points about the pulling of the fire alarm, where the talking points included, you know, we need to focus more on the Nazi Republicans on the other side.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then he had to walk that back. I think some comm staffer got a little out of control, but
I really liked it. Wasn't because I was trying not to vote. It was because I was so eager to vote. That was one of his lines about. I mean, Seth, you mentioned you wanted to talk about this, and we haven't heard from you on it yet. What do you think is the Jamal Bowman situation? Like, it
Well,
was that vote, right? That
I mean, it's like somebody was saying. I mean, everybody walks past fire alarms and through doors every day, and nobody else in history has combined the two. It meant to like confuse the two. Like, oh, if I want to open a door, oh, the door says emergency exit only. Well, that means I have to create an emergency by pulling the fire. I mean, nobody
Oh
makes
no, this is the part
distinct.
where I tell a really embarrassing story about myself, Seth. But go
Okay,
ahead.
maybe
Yeah,
maybe you did. But I
I'm
guess
that.
what I
I'm the
think
one
is
guy. Yeah,
you're the one guy. Okay, but I just think it's
right.
amazing, and it shows how the Democrats have so much discipline that they all got together and buried the story. It's not going. Nothing's going to happen. He's not going to be punished. He's not going to be expelled from Congress or censured. He'll probably, like a friend of mine who works in campaigns said, he'll probably use this to run on. He'll say, like, I'm not afraid to pull the alarm on Republican Nazi tactics or whatever. It'll just be cute. And I don't know. I mean, I guess it's just, okay, chalk another one up for Democrat hypocrisy. Except it's not hypocrisy, because hypocrisy means that they believe something. They're just strictly about power, and if you're on the team, nothing you do matters. So you can make up absurd fibs about why you pulled a fire alarm, and it's just at, at worst it's a foible. What's your embarrassing story? You pulled a fire alarm?
Oh, that I have definitely done that. Yeah, during a rehearsal for a play, I was just full on open the door that set the fire alarm off. So I have some sympathy for this
Okay, but
narrative. But
that's
I mean,
opening a
no,
door. That's opening a
yeah,
door. That's not the same as
everyone's
like
done
yeah,
that.
yeah.
pulling a fire
Oh,
alarm.
okay,
Yeah,
okay.
I meant like
All right. Well, that
separately
makes me feel
pulling a
better.
fire alarm to open the door. Doesn't make any sense.
That's a good point. Like, what happens? What's behind door number 3? Like, if I pull this lever, the trap door opens. No, I mean, it is very funny, and you're right. It's not hypocrisy. It's hierarchy. It's who gets to do what and who gets to notice what and say what, and also the celebration parallax, of course, the classic Mike Anton line. I will close just by saying, to complete my earlier subtweet comment, I will round it out, Ryan, by saying that is good tea about the Democrats betraying McCarthy. I did not know that. And that's very interesting.
Yeah, well,
Something to watch. Yeah.
I had a text from someone who like is not normally acquainted with all this at all, and they said, why are they kicking them out of offices? That just seems petty. And my initial response was, well, it was odd that McCarthy let Pelosi stay in that office to begin with. And so it's actually normal business to kick people out of offices. In fact, one of the great kicker out of offices in spiteful fashion is Nancy Pelosi when she's running things. So yeah, it's
Great.
it's amazing. Not amazing, but it's just, people who aren't immersed in the arcane processes and status hierarchies and stuff of Congress. A lot of this looks odd, but there's a logic behind it. Even when I just chalked the kicking out of offices up to the changing of the power. And now that McCarthy was gone, he didn't have to keep his deal. But I didn't realize, maybe it was reported at the time, but I didn't realize that initially him accepting that one vote vacancy rule was dependent on him getting reassurances from the Democrats that they wouldn't let him twist in the wind and get hanged. And they did.
Very juicy, very petty. You love to see it. Okay, more to follow on that surely coming up. We had a topic that I'm going to call an audible on and save for another time, and that is the shameful evisceration of Trump's business, at least putatively, by this judge, Arthur Engeron, and the whole case against him for like doing what basically every real estate guy does and overstating his creditworthiness. But we'll get to that another time, because now it is time once again to remind you all to read the damn site. This is not just a podcast. You don't just get it for free. Actually, you do get it for free, and you get the site for free too, but you have to go look at it. It's at americanmind.org. We like to highlight a piece each every week. And this week, I would really like to commend to you the article How to Turn a Cold War Hot by Adam Ellwanger. Adam has written for us on various topics. He always, whatever he writes about, he brings sort of a wealth of resources and also eloquence and just really real sort of care and moderation, but also forthrightness and fearlessness. He is able to speak on difficult, spicy topics with both goodwill and honesty, which is a rare combination. So this is a piece about the immigration crisis, the border overflow. It's particularly about Texas, because that's where Adam is. He lives in Houston, which he notes is the fourth biggest city in America. And he says, in the last month alone, the tally of immigrants who entered the nation illegally, the ones we are aware of anyway, was equivalent to the population of Charleston, South Carolina. And Adam repeatedly says, that an actual war, taking up arms over this issue, is the last thing that he would ever want. And also he thinks the last thing that most people in Texas would want, most people of goodwill. And yet, increasingly, it seems as if the options are submit to and even indeed celebrate the just total evaporation of the southern border, or pursue extra governmental means of redress. And so the question that Adam poses is, if Texans cannot and will not abandon every effort to control the flow of immigration, what's next? Just a really smart and well-researched piece that highlights the absolute abject irresponsibility and the effrontery of letting the border go unpoliced, and indeed demanding that it be unpoliced. So, How to Turn a Cold War Hot by Adam Ellwanger. The Fed's got Seth. Ryan, what do you got?
I really like this piece, a pseudonymous piece called Irregular Order Part 1. So it's going to be part of a feature, the opening salvo of which was from Theo Wold, not a pseudonym. Both of these folks worked in the Trump administration, of course, the pseudonymous author and Theo. Theo has a response to Vivek Ramaswamy's white paper and speech at America First Policy Institute on what to do about the bureaucracy. Theo, well, I don't want to talk about that. Read Theo's piece, but the Irregular Order Part 1 by Lancelot Lamar is what I want to point your attention to. And it's someone who has deep knowledge of the process of appropriation and this thing that's very current now, which is the prospect of government shutdown and all that. He lays out the case that really, the temptation, and we've talked about this here too, is to go back to regular order if you take the presidency and two houses of Congress, to go through regular appropriations, et cetera. But he's skeptical of that succeeding, because this process of using a continuing resolution with a week to go, where you pass it all or the government shuts down, has a lot of allies. The bureaucracy loves it because it allows them to get fully funded in their various operations, and the bureaucracy is where a lot of the juice is in national policy making. They do it through rulemaking, regulation, et cetera. And there's a lot of the establishment on both sides of the aisle that are pretty comfortable with this process and are comfortable with how the bureaucracy does government. Part of the reason for which is a classic game theory thing. The congressmen get to say, that wasn't me affecting your property rights or your bottom line. It was the bureaucracy. It's really a horrible thing. Let me see what I can do to get you some relief. Meanwhile, they're sort of responsible for enabling the bureaucracy in the first place. Anyway, this way of doing things has been in place for at least 40 years, better part of 50. And so the not continuing resolutions, but the way of doing bureaucratic government, the problem of continuing resolutions and pushing it all through and threatening shutdown and using it to get all the things you want under the cover of darkness. That's, less old, maybe 30 years. Anyway, the whole piece is about what the next administration should do about all this stuff. And I thought it was very interesting. It treats the shutdown as inevitable, but argues in favor of wielding it. It's just one piece of this piece, and this is the first of two parts. So go look at both. The next one will come out later this week. But the more interesting part in this is to say, don't go for regular order. It's probably going to be a pipe dream. Embrace irregular order and use shutdowns to target the bureaucracy's weaknesses and to exact some cost of the bureaucracy, and thus indirectly exact some cost to the shutdown upon members who rely on the bureaucracy or like it. So it's kind of a jujitsu argument in favor of shutdowns, and beyond just the normal way in which an administration blames shutdown on Congress, et cetera. It's to sort of use it not only to blame the other party, but to draw some real blood from their constituencies in the bureaucracy and elsewhere. So go read Irregular Order Part 1 by Lancelot Lamar, and look out for Irregular Order Part 2.
Yeah, those are both great pieces, Theo's and Lancelot's, plus one of the best suits that anyone's ever chosen for our site. So go check that out. We have now confirmed that the feds got to Seth, so thoughts and prayers to him, but we will close it out and conduct a SWAT team operation to rescue him off mic. Thanks, all of you.
Seth was going to have such a spicy recommendation that
that's right.
The NSA decided to preempt.
It was too, it was too powerful. It would have ended. In fact, the podcast itself would have had to shut down. But thank you all for listening to the censored and edited version of the podcast. We'll save the spicy outtakes for our paying subscribers. Just kidding, it's free. But you should check out all the rest of our stuff. We have a sister publication that I mentioned earlier, the Claremont Review of Books, and it's at ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com. You can subscribe there. You should also check out our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. And you can donate to support all the stuff we do. Tremendously appreciated whenever anybody gives a donation, large or small. It's really how we keep going. Claremont.org/donate is where you do that. Finally, another way to support this show in particular is to give us 5 stars wherever you're listening. If it's on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or what have you, at the very least, keep your bad opinions to yourself. But if you don't mind giving us a 5-star review, that helps boost us in the algorithm and bring us to new listeners. You can also share on whatever social media happens to be your drug of choice. Thanks to our production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Logan Zeppieri. And thanks to you all for listening. We will talk to you next week.